Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for our December faculty development session from Arizona Health Education Alliance. I'm Dr. Jessica Seaman, Academic Success Consultant for GME and co-chair of the Alliance Faculty Development Committee here in Phoenix. We love that Zoom allows us to reach beyond our borders and offer professional development to multiple faculty groups. So thank you for being here. Our committee strives to create and deliver effective sessions that support you, our diverse faculty, as leaders in educational excellence. With that mission in mind, we have another timely presentation for you today, Teaching the Millennial Learner through Case-Based and Team-Based Healthcare Education, delivered by our very own Dr. Nicole Piemonte. Dr. Piemonte is the Assistant Dean for Medical Education and an Assistant Professor in the Department of Medical Humanities at Creighton School of Medicine, Phoenix campus. She has a PhD in Medical Humanities from the University of Texas and completed a fellowship in Applied Ethics at ASU. Nicole's teaching and scholarship focus on how the lived experiences of vulnerability and suffering can contribute to the development of the medical self. Her first book, Afflicted: How Vulnerability Can Heal Medical Education and Practice, was published in January 2018. And she didn't know I was going to do this, but I'm going to put a little plug in for her book. I am partway through it, and it's a beautiful read. So if you haven't picked it up yet, it's a great one. She is currently finishing her second book, Death and Dying, for MIT Press's Essential Knowledge series, which will be released next month. We're very excited to have Dr. Piemonte presenting for us today. Now, just a few housekeeping items. We will be recording this session for future reference, and then there will be several different platforms that you'll be able to receive it by email, on the JADE platform, and then also through, if you have access to JADE, and then also through the CE tracker. And that does require a sign-in and getting an account on that, but it will be offered to you after this presentation. And we do invite you to submit any questions in the Q&A tab. It will be monitored throughout the presentation, and we'll answer as many as we can by the end of the session. There will be a short 4-question survey at the end of the webinar to help us in providing future sessions. Thank you in advance for providing your feedback. Also, last item is this session is eligible for continuing education credit, and you will receive the website and activity code at the end of the presentation. So after question and answer time with Dr. Piemonte, then you will receive a slide, the last slide, and it will have the website for CE tracker. You will need to sign in and get an account, but that is free. And then you will have the date, and that is the easiest way to pull it up by date, this session, and then also the activity code. And then you will be able to download or print a certificate. All right, so Dr. Piemonte, if you're ready, I will stop talking and turn it over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Seaman. Hopefully you guys can hear me. Yes?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so speaking of suffering, Jessica, there's a lot of suffering that goes into reading that book that is boring and long, but thank you for
It's actually beautiful, and I feel like there's so much in there that is almost novel-like. So no, not boring at all.
Appreciate that. So unfortunately well, maybe fortunately for all of you, but unfortunately for me, I don't get to talk about the things that excite me most today, which is suffering, vulnerability, and death and dying. So we won't be talking about that today. We're going to be talking about teaching the millennial learner. So I do want to say that what we're going to talk about today in terms of active learning and best practices in education, I do believe extend to medical students and residents, obviously, but also to nursing students, PT, OT, pharmacy, all kinds of healthcare trainees. A lot of the pedagogical approaches we're going to talk about will be applicable, even though most of my examples will focus on med ed and residents, just because those are the folks with whom I work. But I do believe that this will be something that will be suitable to all of you, regardless of what area of healthcare that you teach in. So a couple of things about the millennial learner. Okay, so the first thing I will say is that maybe some of us on this Zoom call right now we may or may not still be millennials. Millennials extend all the way up till, 37 and 38-year-olds. So, this kind of focus on the millennial learner might be short-lived, because the Gen Z group, they're going to be the next generation of medical students pretty soon. The other thing I want to say about millennial learners is we have all sorts of, I would say, misconceptions about millennials. And so I want to go through a couple of those before we get started, even though there are some kernels of truth in the fact that millennial learners are different learners, but some of our misconceptions might not be accurate. So about a year ago, I was driving into work and listening to NPR, of course, and this story came on why those criticisms about millennials aren't necessarily fair. So this was actually written by an economist, and he was looking at the data of millennials, and he found a couple of things. So the question always comes up of, why are millennials buying houses and having kids so much later in life compared to the generations that preceded them? Well, that's because the economy grew twice as much for Gen Xers and boomers than it has been for millennials. They're in a different economic world, and their student debt is much, much higher than it was for generations before them. So they are taking longer to save money to buy houses and to start a family. So there's also the question of, are millennials non-committal and flighty when it comes to staying in a career for long term? Are they moving from career to career? So when you look at the data, they actually switch jobs at much lower rates than the Gen Xers and the boomers compared to when they were young. And a higher share of millennials actually go to college and graduate from college compared to their predecessors. And because of this, millennials may actually have set themselves up to be more productive in the economy in the long term compared to the generations that came before them. So important things to keep in mind, but maybe not so as important as this fact. The next time somebody complains about millennials, maybe remind them which generation linoleumed over all those beautiful hardwood floors. So as an owner of a historic home in Phoenix, this resonates with me deeply. As a millennial, I never would have put linoleum over hardwood floors, and I had to pull it up in one of our bathrooms. So let's just keep that in mind when we want to be hypercritical of millennials. So that said, there are some differences in the way that millennials learn compared to some of the older generations. So this came out in 2016, and it was looking at an emergency residency and how those residents in that program learned. So the authors of this state that medical education is changing, and millennial learners place priority on self-directed learning using digital library videos and podcasts and social media and other online resources. And the status quo of routine classroom lectures does not meet millennial learner needs. This is really important because in healthcare, and in medicine in particular, we rely heavily on lectures and that kind of didactic, passive information. And actually, this is not working well with millennial learners who are used to just kind of finding their own information online. So this is E.O. Wilson. Some of you might know him as the sociologist who did all that work with ants and ant colonies, but he says something that I think is really important. We're drowning in information while starving for wisdom. The world henceforth will be run by synthesizers, people able to put together the right information at the right time, think critically about it, and make important choices wisely. So while millennials are really good at finding all of that information online, there's so much information that you as educators need to help them synthesize that information, think critically about it, and really kind of grasp onto expertise and conceptual knowledge. So your role as an educator is not to just throw the information at them, but to help them think through that information wisely. So this comes from the president of the ACCME. Those are, the president of the organization that gives you CME credit, actually. And I saw him present this at a conference, and he was talking about the changing role of educators, that educators in medicine are no longer just needing to teach and convey information, my knowledge out of my head, I need to put on a PowerPoint slide and give to you. Rather, educators need to create learning experiences where the learners, residents, the students, they come in having done the pre-work and gotten the info that they need so that when they come in to learn with you, you're not just giving them information, you're helping them synthesize, think through, and apply that information in a clinically relevant way. So we talk a lot about evidence-based medicine, but I want to talk a little bit about evidence-based teaching. What is the most effective teaching modalities within the healthcare system? So this is a picture of our students in Omaha. A colleague of mine took it through the window. You can see the reflection of the blinds there. And while the students are in an active learning space, they don't look very engaged. This guy doesn't look like he's doing too great. So they are sitting in a lecture right now, even though they're in an active learning space, and they're just passive and not engaged. So what is it about this traditional passive learning, which aside from being boring to some of our learners, why doesn't it work, right? So I looked through some of the literature, and while this is only one article, and I understand that it's only one article, it was interesting that when they looked at medical students who were on their radiology rotation, there was no difference in long-term knowledge retention between the students who showed up for lecture and the students who didn't. So they were not better off for going to those passive didactic sessions than if they just had not shown up at all. So here are our students. You might recognize some of them. Some are on our campus now, but this is when they were back in Omaha. They're in their active learning small group space. They look a lot more engaged. They're working through a case, and we're going to talk about case-based learning in a bit. But this is the kind of learning we want to see them engaged in more often. So our medical school went through a curriculum revision. This is a curriculum we'll be bringing to the Phoenix campus, and it's called the New ERA curriculum. So ERA is experience, reflection, and action. So our learners are encouraged to consider the context in which they're learning, have an experience, might be a standardized patient, it might be working through a case, reflect on that experience. How does that change my action in the world? And then evaluating my actions and then going through context again. So really getting them to be reflective on their active learning. So I want to return to this slide one more time because what we're trying to do here is create learning experiences rather than the memorize and regurgitate kind of model that we've seen in medical education for a long time. So this is important because when we look at retention and our students and our residents' ability to retain that information, if you're just receiving passively, the bottom here, receiving passively, whether through a podcast or a recorded lecture or just reading, you're going to retain less than 20%. If you're participating, so you're in a discussion, people are asking you questions, there's a real demonstration, you can retain between 20 and 75%. And then, you know this, learning by doing, actually seeing patients or a standardized patient, you can retain greater than 75% of that knowledge. So when you look at what's been published out there on active learning, it might not be surprising, maybe surprising to some of you, but this was some research that came out of Stanford looking at STEM education for undergrads, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics and medicine. So what they found was that in a course, they were comparing courses that had active learning versus passive learning. And you can see that the failure rates within that class, that it was significantly greater chance that you would fail the class if it was lecture only compared to active learning. And then when they did these concept tests, So these are tests that are concept inventory tests, are testing your core knowledge in a field. So if this was engineering, this would be like the core concepts that would allow you to become an expert in engineering. We see that if it was just lecturing, they performed this curve. And then if they had active learning, they had about half of a standard deviation improvement on their tests when it was an active learning based on core concepts. So this is really important. This is from the same study because the authors say nearly all techniques labeled as active learning include those features known to be required for the development of expertise. So we want our healthcare students to become experts, to have that deep conceptual knowledge of how to care well for patients, and that it's active learning that speaks to expertise more so than passive learning, which is just content memorization. So when we think again about retention, it's a little horrifying to consider that people forget about 80% of what they've learned within 1 or 2 days. This is why those of you who went through medical school, you remember cramming for a test, taking it, and then by Monday you were like, I don't even remember that test. I don't even remember what the questions they asked. It's just in and out when you cram for a test, right? So review and repetition are really critical. So this is the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve. So in the late 1800s, this guy did this research on what it takes to retain information. And you see that the first time you study, you can, okay, 100% of my content, and then that decreases to about 50% in the next day or two. And so you repeat and you go up to 100 and then you come down. And by the 4th or 5th time that you see content, you can retain close to 90% of that content, but it takes a lot of reviewing. Now, retention requires active review. This is not just, oh, I'm going to reread my notes passively. So active review should require some mental work. It should feel like quizzing, right? It should feel like quizzing or testing. So this is Ali Abdal. He just graduated medical school in the UK, and he put these YouTube videos out that my medical students love. And he talks about how you can like deeply retain knowledge and perform better on tests. And so he alludes to this study that was in the Journal of Experimental Psychology in 2010, which showed that when students took a practice test in the middle of their study period, say they studied for 4 weeks, and 2 weeks in, they either restudied or they took a practice test and then restudied again. Those who took a practice test in the middle of their studying of 4 weeks did so much better on the real exam because it required them to do this mental work and actively recall information in the back of their brains to perform on that practice test. And so the simple act of practice tests without any other changes in study habits resulted in a huge improvement on the real exam. So what does this mean for you as an educator? Well, quizzes and tests can be either formal or informal, right? So we could have a multiple choice quiz that we give to medical or nursing students partway through the semester that helps them retain information. Or for your residents, it might be their ITEs, their in-training exams that serve as a way for them to actively recall information. But it can also be informal. So you could use poll everywhere or clickers in your lectures. I know that some of you are doing this, or even the Socratic method of asking questions and requiring that the students or the residents who are in your lecture participate and have a dialogue with you while you're teaching can really help them retain information. So I want to talk a little bit more about that poll everywhere, or what they're calling audience response systems. This is what they call it in the literature, and how effective that those can be. So this was a family medicine residency curriculum. This appeared in the Journal of Family Medicine. And they were looking at audience response when you use those clickers or use poll everywhere on your cell phone. So post-lecture quiz scores, 61% correct, that was their quiz score, 61% for non-interactive lecture. 93% correct on quizzes when the lecture was interactive, having a dialogue back and forth, asking questions to the audience members without poll everywhere or clickers. And then 96% correct on the quiz when they had an interactive lecture that also used audience response clickers or poll everywhere. We see this also in OBGYN in those residency training programs. So residents who had a standard lecture saw a 2% improvement between pre-test and post-test. Residents who had an audience response interactive lecture saw a 21% improvement. And 82% of those residents thought that the audience response was a helpful learning aid. And audience response systems are really easy to use, and it just requires your residents or your students to pay attention and to actively recall information. So feedback from quizzes or from audience response, it's important for retention and to kind of keep hold of that information for longer, but it's also important because overconfidence of my own knowledge is a problem. Okay, so there's some fascinating research about this. This was a group of undergrads where they had asked the students when they took an exam, while they were leaving the classroom, they said, how well do you think you did on that exam? Okay, so here's perceived mastery, how well the students thought they did. Perceived test for performance. So this solid line is how well did you know the material coming into class? And then how well do you think you just did on that exam? And this is their actual performance. Okay, so this is what's a little unsettling is the bottom performers who did pretty poorly on the test thought they did pretty great, right? They lacked a lot of insight into their actual performance. And then you've got these really high performers and high achievers who actually underestimate how well they actually did on the exam. So we see the same thing in healthcare and medical education. So overconfidence on an OBGYN clerkship. This was the perceived exam. This is how well the students thought they did on their shelf exam. This is how well they thought they did clinically on the clerkship. And this is their actual performance. Again, high achievers underestimate themselves. Low achievers, this is an F, they failed. They thought they were at a B or B minus, right? That's a significant discrepancy. So they need feedback because they might be perceiving they're doing much better than they are. The authors of this article say that better performing students tend to underestimate their performance. Poorer performing students tend to overestimate their performance. Below average students have the potential to derive the most benefit from formal feedback. So those of you who are involved in medical education clinically in the hospital, I want you to think about this, that how important it is to give honest, formal feedback to those below average students because they might deeply lack insight into their performance. And they might need to have lots of input coming from whether that's a quiz or from you sitting down and talking to them. They might need some formal feedback. So where this makes me extra nervous is this study that looked at 30 interns who were in OBGYN, and they asked them to rate themselves on some of their clinical skills. And in this particular one, they asked them about their performance in bladder catheterization. So self-rating is in orange, there it is, and the instructor rating is in green. Okay, so we see about 80% of those interns think that they know how to catheterize so well they can teach others. This is the percentage of their supervisors who think they can teach others. And this is the percentage of their supervisors who say these people need supervision as an intern to do this. So what's important here is that they really need some feedback on how they're actually doing with these clinical skills. And what the authors of this article found was that there was no relationship between the self-rating of the resident and the rating of the supervisor. It wasn't like I rated myself poorly and they rated me poorly. I rated myself well, they rated me high. No relationship. They could have been totally disparate. So the feedback for clinical skills is really, really critical when we've got some of our newer residents and interns. So active learning and this kind of feedback and assessments are really important because it can help shape one's own perception of their own skills. But what does this look like in practice? So I want to talk a little bit about what this looks like at the medical school and how we're trying to provide that feedback that's so important, and how we're trying to create these learning experiences rather than passively give didactic information to our students. So our curriculum is based on case-based and team-based learning, CBL and TBL. So we often use CBL, TBL, PBL interchangeably. So I want to clarify these terms because they're really important for those of you who will be teaching in our new curriculum. So CBL, case-based learning, and TBL, team-based learning, are both different from problem-based learning. Problem-based learning is really free form. It's giving a group of students a problem, a clinical problem, and then having them figure it out by going to whatever resources they want to go to. We don't use PBL at Creighton. We use CBL and TBL because CBL is guided inquiry using a case. We provide some guardrails to really help students navigate those cases rather than being totally free form like PBL. So case-based learning is using a case, and TBL is actually a form of assessment. It involves individual readiness assessment, IRAT. I really think that that's such an unfortunate acronym, but this is what they use. IRAT and TRAT. This is what they use nationally and internationally. So you've got an individual readiness assessment. It's a quiz I take by myself. And then a team readiness assessment. I retake the same quiz with my team and hopefully get an improved score. And then application questions. We're going to go through those steps really briefly, but it's important to know case-based learning is what you think it is, learning in a small group with a case. And team-based learning actually happens the next day, and it's more of a quiz or an assessment. CBL and TBL both require pre-work. And there's less need for all those lectures because students should come into the case having already studied the night before and coming in with knowledge that they can apply now to a clinical case. So this is very busy, but I want you to look at the structure. This is 1 week in our medical education program. This is actually in their neuroscience course. And I'll just have you focus on a couple of things. The blue boxes are some of that content that we're delivering to them. We don't want them to be passive lectures, so they might have audience response clickers or poll everywhere, or the lecturer is asking them questions, or it's a flipped classroom. But this is kind of that traditional, let's give them actual content that we've got faculty teaching them. And then you'll see, so this is Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. We always give them the lunch hour off. And you'll see that on Wednesday, they have their first CBL, their case-based learning. They're working in their small group, going through Friedreich's ataxia and Wilson's disease, that they're going to go through a small group. Then you see the next day on Thursday is the TBL, where they're quizzed on that content that they learned through that case. And then later that afternoon, they have another case on tremor and Parkinson's. And then Friday, the following day, they come for that team-based learning where they're quizzed individually and as a team on that content that they learned in their CBL. Now, I probably have some of my colleagues who are on this call who are teaching CBLs and TBLs in Omaha, and this is kind of its idealized form, and it doesn't always manifest the way that we hope, but this is kind of the theoretical underpinnings of CBLs and TBLs. So we saw this picture earlier, but this is the case-based learning. So this is where students come together in their small group to go through a case. They'll go to a small group room when it's not COVID, and they'll open their laptops and they will go to Blue Line, which is where we have all of our content. And let's say they're in their infectious disease course. They're going to click on their infectious disease course, and inside there, they'll have a case that they will start. So I wanted to go through really briefly kind of what these electronic cases look like. They don't have a facilitator in the room. They go through this case as a team, and they get some feedback as they go through. That's how the case is designed, but they don't have a faculty facilitator in the room with them. So this is a case that is about George Williams, who's 56, and he has right leg pain because 2 weeks ago he got in a motorcycle accident, and he got surgery to fix that broken leg, but now he's having increasing pain and drainage where they closed the laceration from his accident, right? So that's the introduction the students are going to get. Then they have discussion questions. So these are important because the students are probably going to take notes on these so they can study later, but these are questions they're talking about with one another. And what's important to look at here is that we try to really have clinical discussion questions, but also basic science discussion questions so they can get to that kind of nitty-gritty that they're learning in the first and second year. So they would discuss those questions together and then they would move on. They might get more of the vignette, but they get to this advancement question, which they can't move forward in the case without writing something in this text box. And so this prevents them from just like blowing through the case really quickly and then going, I'm going to go home and study now. We kind of pace them with these advancement questions that they would type into the field. They'll get a little bit more of this vignette. So, you know, George talks about his accident here, but then he states that he also has type 1 diabetes and he only sporadically takes his insulin. He's also a smoker and he's a drinker, right? So the discussion questions are important here because they're asking the students about the pathophysiology of diabetes affecting wound healing and risk for infection. So we've got these clinical questions, but also wanting to get some of that pathophys in there too. The cases can include images. And so we've got a picture of his fracture here. And then there would be more going on this case. I've abbreviated it. All of our cases end with an epilogue. They always find out what happens to this patient long term. And we have a very rich narrative structure so that these patients are really seen as whole people with complex lives. So we see that George ends up getting a PICC line because he's got an infection exacerbated by his diabetes. And then he gets 6 weeks of this antibiotic. But we also include here that home health nursing is coming to his house and that this care at home results in lower overall healthcare costs and out-of-pocket costs to George. He's very happy about this. It also reduces his risk of hospital-acquired infections. So we're really trying to get students to think of like the social aspects of medical care and that whole context in which they're going to find their patients and getting them to think about the science of healthcare delivery and all sorts of other objectives that we might have in our curriculum. What's really important is that all of these cases end with learning objectives. And we've got a significant number here. The students know that that night they need to go home and study these learning objectives because they're going to have a team-based learning, a TBL, the next day. That's a quiz that is going to be related to these learning objectives. We also give them suggested resources so they're just not out in the ether trying to figure out how to learn and understand these objectives. We give them some chapters or videos that we want them to watch that will help them study these learning objectives. These are important because yes, we've got clinical learning objectives, describe the signs and symptoms present with osteomyelitis, the advantages and disadvantages of imaging studies. So we've got very clinical learning objectives, but we also have basic science learning objectives, etiologic organisms found in bone infections, and then describe the advantages of systems-based home healthcare related to chronic infections. We get some of that social medicine in there. It's not just memorizing basic science information. It's clinically relevant, and it's relevant to the social conditions that affect patients' lives. So the next day, the students would go back to that active learning room I talked about, but they wouldn't be looking up, staring blankly at a didactic passive lecture. They're going to sit at that table, open their laptops, and take their individual readiness assessment, their IRAT, their quiz based on those learning objectives that they got yesterday. So we've got this 63-year-old with diabetes, and they're going to answer what they think is the best, and they're going to go through about 5 to 10 questions, right? Then they get a score for that, and then they retake it as a team. And you can see here, it's the same questions, but now they're doing the best answer, the second best answer, and the third best answer that they've decided as a team. And hopefully their team-based quiz has a better score than their individual quiz. The students will then close their laptops and look up at the front of the room, and they're going to go through the answers to those questions with the faculty facilitator who's in that room. We like to have a clinician and a basic scientist up there, and going through, this, you guys said B here, but this is why it's A, because the facilitator can see what the students chose, and they'll go through all of those questions together. And finally, the faculty will present them with application questions. What these are 5 new questions that the faculty facilitator poses to the group that requires them to apply the knowledge that they learned last night to a novel context to really deepen their knowledge. They will answer as a table or a team, and they will have a discussion in a large group about the answers and the questions. They'll discuss with the facilitator why answers are right and wrong, and really deepen that knowledge. So that's the medical school, but can we do this with residents, for instance? I absolutely think we can, but it would be an abbreviated version of this. So all you need in order to do this is learning objectives for your residents, some pre-work. What do you want them to read before they come to your lecture? What video do you want them to watch? Maybe there's a module. Then they might come to grand rounds or whatever lecture you're having the next day, and you can use a case. And you don't have to spend 40 slides giving them knowledge, because they did that last night. And then they can work through a case with you. And then the quiz, because remember, feedback is so important. And it helps them retain information if you give them a quiz, which could be a poll everywhere quiz. It doesn't have to be a multiple choice quiz. So to summarize all of this, and I know it was a lot, active learning leads to better retention and recall. So don't be afraid of giving pre-work so you're not wasting time giving them information on slides. You can do this with case-based teaching, the Socratic method by just asking them questions throughout a lecture, or using poll everywhere. Assessments can improve retention and recall, but they also provide that really formative feedback that prevents overconfidence. Those can be formal and informal. You can use poll everywhere, a quiz, or an in-training exam. Remember, CBL is case-based learning. Students study the learning objectives after the case, and they use suggested resources that we give to them. And team-based learning, TBL, is a form of assessment. It includes an IRAT, a TRAT, and application questions. Okay, so hopefully all of that has helped you understand a little bit about what we're trying to do in the School of Medicine, and hopefully also applies to the work that you're doing, so you can incorporate some active learning if you're not doing so already. I know many of you are. So I would love to hear any comments or questions that you might have related to active learning, or some practical ways that you might implement this into your own teaching. So what we're going to do is keep an eye on the question and answer so that we can have a conversation. The irony of all of this is that this is a webinar. So I'm not even able to ask you questions. I'm not able to incorporate really anything that I just talked to you about. I gave you a passive didactic lecture. So I'm sorry for that, but I would love to answer some of the questions that you might have. We will keep, and I'll give you a second to type in there, and we'll answer some of those questions. I guess I was just so good that no one has any questions. I know you all do. And when you type those in there, I don't think other people can see them. Can they see them, Jessica?
No, it will just come to you and I, and then we can, and we've got our first question. Do you want to go ahead and read that?
I do.
Okay.
Thank you. Okay, Dr. Abreu, my medical school utilized PBL, problem-based learning. From what I'm seeing, the structure of CBL, TBL looks much more effective for reinforcement of concepts and comprehension. So absolutely, I do agree that the CBL, TBL is much more structured so that the educators can really reinforce the content they think is important. I know that PBL is just kind of that exploration and you're just like hoping you're on the right track. So I do think CBL and TBL provide more structure that helps the students navigate that learning a little bit easier. I will say our students sometimes ask for more structure. Even more structure. What should I focus on TBL? What should I focus on CBL? So it's a really, it's a hard line to toe between totally structuring everything for students and letting them do some of that self-directed learning. Dr. Younger, is there a plan to offer guidance to the faculty that have passive PowerPoints? Yes. Okay, Dr. Younger, it's hard to give feedback to those faculty where you're like, gosh, this is just a really dull PowerPoint. How do we make this more active? I think using Poll Everywhere is a really easy way, or saying like every 3 slides, incorporate a question that you're going to ask the residents in the room and they have to answer it. So even just putting those simple questions can be really, really helpful for getting the residents or the students to start paying more attention and participating. Okay. Oh, good. We've got a lot of people. We've got Dr. Cohen and Mencken. What we got going on over here? Okay. Hi, Dr. Cohen. Would you agree that your ability to remember pictures is better than words, and how is that incorporated? So I do think that depends on the kind of learner that you are. I'm actually someone who I retain words better than I do images and pictures, but there are a lot of people, maybe particularly surgeons like you all, where images are really important. So I think the fact that we incorporate images into the cases can be really critical. And I think having lecturers put graphs together or some kind of diagram can be really helpful when you keep in mind that your group of learners has people who do better verbally, kinesthetically, visually, and really keeping that in mind. So Darwin Brown would be interested in hearing more about how to address the overconfidence in underperforming learners. Did the studies you referenced provide specific suggestions on how to discuss this with those students or provide direction for remediation feedback? Thank you. That is such a good question. So for our clinical learners, it can be really helpful to, if you observe them doing something clinically and then asking them, how do you think that went? Even though people sometimes think they overperform and do better than they do, a lot of them will have insight and say, oh, I really think I should have done this a little better. And that just opens up the opportunity for you to say, I totally agree. Here's some things that you can do better, right? So asking them how they think they did can be the gateway to having a really hard conversation. The other thing I will say, focus on observable behavior. So we want to make assumptions all the time as to why people do the things they do. And we're like, why did you do that? That made no sense that you did that with that patient. Instead, you can say, I noticed the first question you asked that patient was this. How about next time you start with this? So starting your statement with I noticed or I saw is an objective statement about observable behavior that's way better for me to hear as a learner than your assumption about my character or my motivation. Dr. Pararoti, I envision trying an abbreviated version in the ambulatory setting. Do you know of applications tried? So what I've seen in ambulatory setting, if you're going to be giving an educational session, so a PowerPoint, the Poll Everywhere works really, really well. And they're really easy to create. You can create a free Poll Everywhere account at polleverywhere.com. It just requires the learners to respond via text, and then you get all of the answers and you incorporate it into your PowerPoint, and then everybody can see the responses on the slide in front of you. Can be really, really helpful. My go-to would be Poll Everywhere, easy way to start making learning active. Dr. Dunley, is my chalkboard gone forever? Oh, you know what you could do? You can write a question to your audience using the chalkboard. Or you could draw a picture, because pictures work really well for people, apparently. Okay, Stanley Thomas, is there data on the results of board scores with CBL, TBL system? It seems step 1 and 2 on minutia versus clinical management. Such a good question. So our students in the new curriculum using CBL and TBL are going to be taking step 1 very soon, and we will have that data for you. So when there's a curriculum revision, it is not uncommon to see a dip in step 1 scores. It's just by virtue of just trying to get that curriculum off the ground, it's what happens. But we could talk a lot about step 1 and step 2 and how important I think clinically relevant learning and conceptual understanding is so much more important than performance on a standardized exam. But we know that students really, really want to do well on step 1 and step 2. Fortunately, step 1 is going to pass fail. But we will have that data. So what we've seen nationally is like pretty consistent. I don't think we've seen this like sharp uptick in, wow, CBL, TBL is making students do so well on step 1. We don't see that, but we also don't see this crash and burn either. So when we have the data of how our students do, I think it would be really fun to share that with all of you. Dr. Stolzberg, hi Ned. Agree that interactive learning is fantastic for clinical info. Does this integrate into the basic science curriculum as well? Thank you so much for that question. So yes, CBL and TBL are used in the first and second year. So this is the basic science curriculum, but at Creighton, we've tried to make it clinically relevant. So that's why those discussion questions and advancement questions in the case is so important, because even though it's a case, I'm an M1, I'm learning about a case, and I'm learning about this patient, and it's all clinically relevant. In order for me to advance to the next part of the case, I have to answer some questions on pathophysiology and mechanisms of action and all that basic science stuff that you guys learn. They have to apply that to the case. And then those learning objectives at the very end of the case require them to understand basic science knowledge in order to do well on the TBL the next day. So we're trying to make that basic science curriculum very clinically relevant while not distracting students too much from that basic science knowledge, which is critical, not only to becoming a doctor, but for step 1 and step 2. Dr. Abreu, I saw a lot of excellent test takers struggled with the nuanced decision-making needed in clinical medicine. This theme of helping develop critical thinking and, dare we hope, wisdom seems to be desperately needed in medicine. I'm wondering if we're changing what we value in applicants to try to screen for these values. That's such a great point. So we all have seen medical students or healthcare students, whether they were your peers or me being involved in medical education, who are excellent test takers. They've always been great at standardized exams. They were great at the SAT, the MCAT, step 1, step 2, and then struggling when they become third years to start applying that clinical knowledge in a way that is necessary for medicine. I want to screen for applicants who know that conceptual knowledge. I'm just not sure we've got the tools or the instruments that help us discern that. It's helpful when I do interviewing and I'm like, wow, this person doesn't have wisdom necessarily of medicine or insight into what it's going to take to be a good doctor. A lot of them are also like 22. Maybe they don't have that yet. So we struggle making those assumptions about people, but I wish it wasn't so weighted on those standardized exams, because when we weight that so much, we do get really great test takers who might lack the kind of wisdom, the clinical wisdom that we're looking for. So, okay, I think that was the last question. Do we have any other last questions or ideas? Thoughts, comments? Doesn't have to be a question either. Sorry, it's hard when you guys can't unmute yourselves and have a conversation, but I appreciate those questions.
I don't see any others on the list. And while we are, oh, here's one right here. Says really wonderful presentation and excited to work with you.
Thank you, Dr. Younger.
Dr. Younger, oh, here they go. You opened up the floodgates.
Thank you all. I really, really appreciate that. I hope that this was somewhat helpful in terms of applying active learning into your own teaching and gives you a bit of insight into what you might be signing up for if you want to come teach in the School of Medicine, because we are kind of really committed to this active learning in our curriculum. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Piemonte. I love hearing about active learning. It's something that we need to do even clear back in preschool and kindergarten and all the way up through medical school. I love to see, and through residency, I love to see active learning all the way up through adult education. So thank you so much for helping us with our teaching and learning. I am going to share my screen so that you can see the continuing education credit. And then Nicole, if you could just let me know, did that pop in?
Yes, it did.
Okay, we will go ahead and leave this for about 3-4 minutes. And thank you so much, everybody, for participating, and have a great rest of your week.